straight at the Russian President Vladimir Putin. And that message has been echoed by the United Kingdom, Ukraine and the United States.
Make no mistake, Putin is responsible for Navalny's death. Putin is responsible.
Tonight, a further crackdown on dissent in Moscow as mourners who defied an order not to protest were arrested. All of that to come in the next 60 minutes on The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Good evening. Just yesterday, we saw pictures of Alexei Navalny in court, laughing and joking. Today, Vladimir Putin's fiercest political opponent, who rallied against the Russian president with allegations of corruption for years, is dead. The Russian prison service claims the 47-year-old died after falling unwell following a walk. Navalny's wife and leaders across the world have dismissed that claim and say responsibility lies with one man, Vladimir Putin. Tonight, we've seen another example of his contempt for dissent. Muscovites who dared to come out to pay tribute to Navalny were arrested. More on that in a moment. But first, here's our main report from Sky's international affairs editor, Dominic Waghorn.
This was Alexei Navalny only yesterday, not a man visibly on death's door. Laughing and joking with a federal judge in a court hearing. But 24 hours later, Russian state TV was announcing his unexpected demise. After a walk in jail, it said, Navalny had felt unwell and lost consciousness. Doctors tried to resuscitate the activist, say authorities, but failed. Alexei Navalny leaves a wife, Yulia, and 2 children. Yulia was with world leaders at the Munich Security Conference as the news came through, but somehow still found the courage to address them.
You've probably all already seen the terrible news today. I thought for a long time whether I should come out here or fly straight to my children. But then I thought, what would Alexei do in my place? And I'm sure he would be here. He would be on this stage.
Alexei Navalny was known worldwide for his astonishing courage, standing up to Russia's corrupt regime that first poisoned him, then put him in jail, and now it seems has killed him. His death has brought swift condemnation.
He was so many things that Putin was not. He was brave, he was principled, he was dedicated to building a Russia where the rule of law existed and where it applied to everybody. Navalny believed in that Russia. He knew it was a cause worth fighting for, and obviously even dying for.
Alexei Navalny's multiple sentences on trumped-up charges prompted calls in the West for sanctions on Putin. They were repeated today.
Well, there should be consequences because there's no doubt in my mind this man was a brave fighter against corruption, for justice, for democracy, and look what Putin's Russia did to him. They trumped up charges, they imprisoned him, they poisoned him, they sent him to an Arctic penal colony, and he's died. And that is because of the action that Putin's Russia took. No one can look at this regime now and not recognize it for the truly dreadful nature that it has.
Alexei Navalny was a potent critic of Putin's war in Ukraine. Its president, Vladimir Zelensky, also in Germany, blamed the Russian president for his death.
To me, it's obvious he was killed, like the thousands of others who were tortured to death because of this person. Putin doesn't care who dies as long as he maintains his own position.
The Russian leader himself was smiling his way through a photo opportunity with students and engineers. There was no mention of his arch-rival's death. That was left instead to other officials who were making it all sound like just another routine death in jail.
As far as we know, with all the current rules, the Federal Penitentiary Service is engaged in all checks and clarifications. No specific instructions are required because there is a certain set of rules that the service is guided by.
Ordinary Muscovites were paying their respects with flowers in the snow. While most Russians have gone along quietly with their country's slide into totalitarian rule, Alexei Navalny always fought against it, and now it seems has paid the price. Dominic Waghorn, Sky News.
Well, our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes, is here with me now in Munich. Deborah, thanks very much for joining me. You're in another part of this hotel, and all day we've seen the delegations here talk about Alexei Navalny, pay tribute to him, but also condemn the Russian President, Vladimir Putin.
Yes, and we also heard from delegates that were inside when his wife addressed them, saying that she received a huge amount, a long-standing round of applause before she even spoke, and then saying that her words were incredibly moving for those in the audience. It has absolutely dominated events on the first day. There have been a couple of people that I've spoken to who have questioned whether it was more than a coincidence that the death happened on such a significant day, given that this, for Germany, is its landmark annual security conference when world leaders descend here in Munich to talk about security in Europe. And once again, the agenda is being dominated not by what they are choosing to talk about, but by what is happening in Russia. And of course, as you said, huge condemnation for the actions of Vladimir Putin. However, Alexei Navalny died. The fact that he was in jail, everybody realises and appreciates here, is because of his opposition to the Russian president.
Yes, very much so. Over and over again throughout the day, we've heard the delegates say that if he wasn't in jail, this wouldn't have happened to him. And as you say, it really has dominated this entire conference when there are so many issues on the agenda, including what happens in Ukraine and the kind of support that the Ukrainians are asking Western leaders to make at this time.
Yes, it's really interesting. The ministers and other delegates I've been speaking to throughout the afternoon keep on saying that they hope that if anything positive can come out of this awful tragedy, that it will really galvanise the West to continue that support for Ukraine. All eyes are on the US Congress and whether or not it's going to pass this significant funding bill, which Ukraine's military is waiting for and needs vitally to be able to continue its fight against Russian forces. And I was also speaking to Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who you'll remember was that very brave woman who stood against Lukashenko, the leader of Belarus, a very close ally to Putin. She won back in 2020 and is here today saying that the West needs to stand up, not just for Ukraine, but for her fight against the Lukashenko regime in Belarus.
OK, Deborah, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks very much for bringing us up to date. That was our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes, talking to me from here in Munich from the security conference. Well, as I mentioned earlier, Alexei Navalny's anti-corruption foundation has been a thorn in the side of Vladimir Putin. Joining us live now is an advisor to the foundation's board, the philosopher and author Francis Fukuyama. Mr. Fukuyama, thank you very much for joining us here on the programme. First of all, your reaction to this news today?
Well, I was utterly shocked and appalled. I didn't really expect an event like this to happen at this particular juncture. And I think it's just a terrible tragedy for the possibility of a free Russia, for all of the young Russians that actually hope that there is some alternative to the dictatorship that Vladimir Putin has created in their country. So I'm really just at a loss for words.
Yeah, I mean, you knew him well. You understood what he stood for. You've said that actually, you know, that Alexei Navalny was a thought process. It was bigger than just one man, what he actually stood for.
I was on a panel with him in Warsaw in November of 2019, and we both talked about the need for democracy and some real alternatives and some real political competition. And he had invited me actually to go to Moscow in March of 2020 to be on a panel with him, because at that time he thought that there was enough space so that you could actually have a debate, an open debate in Moscow. And then COVID intervened, and then he was poisoned. And he went back after having survived the poisoning attack. and has been in prison ever since. And the situation in Moscow has just gotten worse with the invasion of Ukraine. Many of his supporters were forced to leave the country. We run a couple of programs, my center at Stanford, for emigre Russians, and really everybody has been squeezed out that at one point or another expressed any support for Navalny. And so you're really left with a pretty desolate landscape of opposition at the moment.
Yes, and where do you think that leaves things, given this level of crackdown? I mean, we even saw a crackdown today for those who came out to pay tribute to Alexei Navalny in Moscow.
Well, in the short run, I don't think that there's much hope for any kind of real competition or democracy. Vladimir Putin is going to win the coming presidential election by a huge margin. It's going to be a rigged election because he's not letting any serious opponent run against him. I think that there's several factors that may affect the situation. One is the war in Ukraine. It's been a disaster for Russia. Unfortunately, the U.S. Congress, and particularly the right-wing Republicans there, have in effect switched sides, and they're now more sympathetic to Putin than they are to Zelensky and to a free Ukraine. But that fight is not over, and I think if this terrible event shame some of those Republicans into changing their views, then that might actually have an effect on the war, because the weapons supply has been cut off from the U.S. for the last several weeks, and the Ukrainians, really need that very badly. And that would be actually a really appropriate response to this murder if the United States could actually begin or reopen its supply line.
You say that the war in Ukraine has been really bad for Russia, but do you think in recent weeks, given the situation in the United States and given the fact that this potential aid bill is sort of blocked, that it has emboldened the Russians?
Well, certainly the discord in Congress and the Republicans' opposition to aid for Ukraine has convinced Putin that, he's going to outlast the United States. He's said that right from the beginning of the war. And unfortunately, that's going to be true if, they continue this blockade. But, American politics right now is very much up in the air. And I think that there's still a possibility that they could do a deal, or again, that this incident could convince enough Republicans to, switch back to support of Ukraine. And if that happens, I don't think the war is over. And I think that the long-term consequences for Russia are going to be very severe in terms of the weakening of its economy, in terms of all of the young Russians that have been killed and wounded so far.
OK, well, we're very grateful for your thoughts there, Francis Fukuyama. Thank you very much for joining us here on the programme. OK, we've just got some breaking news that's come in. The Foreign Office, we're being told, has summoned the Russian embassy today. And in a statement, they said Alexei Navalny has dedicated his life to exposing the corruption of the Russian system, calling for free and open politics and holding the Kremlin to account. His death must be investigated fully and transparently. The Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office today summoned, as I said, the Russian embassy to make clear that we hold the Russian authorities fully responsible. Mr. Navalny was a man of great courage and iron will. Even from his prison cell, he continued to speak up for the rights of the Russian people. His dedication to human rights and exposing corruption was an inspiration to millions. The ideals for which he stood and died will live forever. And of course, we did, of course, hear from Lord Cameron as well today. But that is a statement from the Foreign Office saying they've summoned the Russian embassy today, asking for a full and transparent investigation into the death of Alexei Navalny. And we will be bringing you more developing news and updates throughout the evening. But joining me now is financier and Kremlin critic Bill Browder for his thoughts. And Bill, you knew Alexei Navalny very well. Just tell me how today has been. It's been a very difficult day for so many.
It's been just a horrible day. It's the news that he was killed, and let's not mince words here. He was murdered. He didn't die. He was murdered. He was murdered at the hands of Vladimir Putin. Putin tried to kill him back in 2020 with Novichok. He failed. He succeeded in killing him today. And to watch somebody who I knew, who I respected, who I worked with, basically murdered in the light of day was a huge, huge shock to the system.
Did you think this would happen?
Well, in one way, I thought it would happen immediately. So they tried to kill him back in 2020 with Novichok. He barely survived. He was in a coma. They airlifted him to Germany. It took him weeks to get out of a coma. He eventually built himself back up. And then he went back on a plane knowing that he was going to be arrested the moment he landed in Moscow, and arrested by the people who tried to kill him. And so every day that went by, I and many people said to ourselves, they're going to kill him. And I guess in a certain way, what's surprising is that he went back, I think, in early 2021, and we're here now in 2024, and they finally, now is the moment that they killed him. They had every opportunity to do it before. I guess they chose this week to do it.
And that is the big question. Why now?
Well, I think that there's several reasons. One is that there's different audiences for this murder. Well, the first is they wanted to eliminate a political opponent. The second is that they wanted to show everybody in Russia that if you are in opposition to Putin, you will face the most dramatic outcome, which is death. And I think that there's also a message to us sitting here in Munich at the Munich Security Conference, which is that Putin can cross every red line and get away with it. And I think that he has a lot of different audiences that he wanted to communicate to.
What do you think the United States, the West, should do now?
Well, first and foremost, there's a small but influential contingent in the U.S. Congress who are blocking military aid to Ukraine to fight Putin. It didn't make sense before, but I don't know how any self-respecting individual can get up in front of their constituents or their colleagues and say that they want to support Putin after he's murdered his most important political opponent in broad daylight. And so I think that the first thing that should be done, it's not directly related to Navalny, is that the money should be released so Putin can face the consequences of what he's done in Ukraine. And secondly, and this is very important, is that while Alexei Navalny is the most famous political prisoner, there's a number of other ones.
Absolutely, and we are going to keep you with us throughout the program, Bill, to talk about all of those issues. We will have to go to a break now. You're watching The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Coming up, our Moscow correspondent will be looking back at the life of Alexei Navalny.
Well, we've had a number of pandemics, epidemics, which is well known of plague over the centuries, but the disease never actually went away. It's hidden away in animal reservoirs, usually rodents in certain parts of the world. One of them is Oregon, and the island of Madagascar is another one. So we have to be vigilant because we occasionally see these sporadic cases. I think worried is not the word. I think concerned really about the knowledge of what these organisms are doing. We need to be vigilant, really, because we need to have the right surveillance systems in place, like we have in Oregon, where if the organism crosses from rodents, from animals into humans, the danger is that it could then spread between humans. It's not happened in Oregon, but it has happened recently in other parts of the world. So surveillance is really, and vigilance is really the word we're looking for in the context of plague. All the common diseases that we've got, or many of them, they've got measles, for example, whooping cough, typhoid, originally were in animals and they spread into humans. And once they start to spread between humans, that's the real danger, because they adapt to humans, the human lifestyle, the human physiology, and they become more of a threat. And that's what happened in the previous plague pandemics, where there was a breakdown in healthcare. In fact, there wasn't any healthcare really in the centuries ago. And so we need to put in place systems where we can watch the danger of human to human spread. Well, there was an outbreak recently in Madagascar where around 30 people died of plague, and that we did see human-to-human transmission. But luckily, in the modern world, we can intervene and prevent these outbreaks. Unfortunately, in the case of COVID, we weren't able to do that, and we saw the consequences because it was such an infectious agent. We have Ebola in Africa, which is periodically emerging. I think the danger is these viruses and germs can evolve.
Welcome back to The World with me, Yalda Hakim, live from the Munich Security Conference, where delegates here are coming to terms with the death of Alexei Navalny. And as we've been reporting, the finger of blame has been squarely pointed at Russia's President Vladimir Putin. There have been condemnations right round the world. Global leaders have said he should now be facing consequences. Well, Navalny was, after all, Russian president's fiercest opponent. He was a man capable of bringing thousands of people out onto the streets. Our Moscow correspondent, Diana Magnay, has been looking back on his life and legacy.
Alexei Navalny lived and died fighting Vladimir Putin's regime and the corruption at its heart. Banned in 2018 from running in elections, he remained Putin's most powerful political opponent, the one man capable of bringing tens of thousands to the streets, the man Putin famously refused to mention by name.
Navalny is an idea that Russia could be rich, successful, and a well-developing country, a country where we would want to live.
He was stubborn, sarcastic, and charismatic. His YouTube investigations into Putin and his cronies garnering millions of views and exposing graft of the highest order. But it was in August 2020 that Alexei Navalny became a global name when he was poisoned on board a flight from Siberia. The poison was Novichok, a weapons-grade nerve agent that Russia had used 2 years earlier against the former KGB spy Sergei Skripal in Salisbury. Navalny fell into a coma, and for 3 days his wife Yulia fought for him to be airlifted to Berlin, while doctors in Russia dithered over the diagnosis. Under German care and with his family beside him, Navalny slowly recovered. He blamed Vladimir Putin directly for his poisoning and managed to get one of the Russian security agents involved to admit that he'd placed the poison in Navalny's underpants.
Well, we focused on the inner seams. At least those were the parts we treated.
Western countries imposed sanctions for what they said was another Russian breach of the Chemical Weapons Convention. But President Putin laughed it off.
It doesn't mean he should be poisoned. Who needs him anyway? If someone wanted to, they would have probably finished it.
Once he'd recovered, Navalny stunned the world by announcing that he was returning to Russia.
I realized I'm nearly healthy. and the rest I can cure at home.
Many questioned why, but his life's work was in Russia. For him, there was no other choice. He was immediately arrested and imprisoned. The years inside extending into decades as fresh charges were levelled against him, all of which he said were politically motivated. Tens of thousands took to the streets on his return, the largest unsanctioned protests in Putin's Russia. But the crackdown was brutal, and once Putin invaded Ukraine, which Navalny strongly opposed, demonstrations of any kind were effectively crushed. In a remote prison colony north of the Arctic Circle, Navalny's health deteriorated. He knew what would likely come, and he'd forewarned his supporters and encouraged them to keep up his fight.
Если это произошло, это означает, что мы необыкновенно сильны в этот момент, раз они решили меня убить. Ну и нужно использовать эту силу, не сдаваться, помнить о том, что мы огромная сила, которая находится под гнетом вот этих вот чуваков плохих, лишь потому что мы не можем осознать, насколько действительно мы сильны. Все, что нужно для торжества зла, это бездействие добрых людей. Поэтому бездействовать не надо.
Diana Magnay, Sky News.
Well, in Moscow, people defied orders not to gather so that they could pay tribute to Alexei Navalny. People laid flowers at monuments to victims of Soviet-era repression. The authorities had warned citizens against taking part in mass action. But later, pictures emerged apparently showing the arrest of mourners and journalists in both Moscow and St. Petersburg.
Alexei Navalny was the last beacon of hope for anything to change, and that hope died today. So the only thing I want to do now is cry. I have no more words.
Yes, we want to cry, but the hope won't die. I think the revolution cannot be defeated. Everything will come back in its place, and common sense and well-being of people will prevail.
If this is really true, then I actually have a lot of emotions about it. This is anger, and perhaps this is a loss of faith in positive changes in the future.
I feel bad for Alexei Navalny, and I also feel bad about what happened. Navalny's death, it seems to me, characterizes the nature of our state.
Frankly, in a week, the information noise will completely disappear. A week, 7 days.
So what's left of the opposition in Russia? Let's bring in our Moscow correspondent, Diana Magnay. And Diana, I know this has been a difficult time for many people in Russia and across the globe who admired how fearless Alexei Navalny was. And for so many of those supporters inside Russia, it's been a particularly tough day.
Terrible. And I think that those people who did support him inside and outside of Russia have had to swallow so many very, very bitter moments over the last 2 years since the beginning of the war. Well, in fact, from the time that he was poisoned in August 2020, and then his return, then seeing him imprisoned, then this war beginning, then mobilization. That's why so many of his supporters left the country. And those that have stayed have just had to basically sit quiet. And when you say, is there really any opposition left? I think, unfortunately, the answer is no. You know, Alexei Navalny called from within prison, getting his message out via his lawyers onto social media, trying to get people to stand up more against the fact that this war was going on. And because of the nature of the repressions in Russia, because the security forces are so capable of shutting anything down, you know, the small protests that we saw stopped. And I mean, I think today you see people coming to lay flowers, that is allowed, but as soon as you see people holding up any kind of a banner, they're arrested. You've seen journalists covering people laying flowers arrested. And I don't think this kind of demonstration of grief has very much more to run. What we heard from that man saying in a week the noise will probably subside is probably true.
Diana, thank you so much for bringing us up to date there. That's our Moscow correspondent, Diana Magnay. I just want to bring in our panel back into the conversation. Bill Browder, who we've been speaking to, but I also want to introduce Julia Yoffe, a journalist. And Julia, I remember, over a decade ago, you wrote the first profile piece on Alexei Navalny, and he wasn't very well known then, but he became known as the fiercest Putin critic. In fact, Vladimir Putin famously never said his name.
Yeah. It's funny. I was remembering that time today. It was late 2010. Navalny was this very popular blogger. He had a very popular live journal. That was the kind of the forum back in the day. And I was going to maybe write a blog post or an online article about him. This was, 2010. And I went and met him for lunch. And I remember just being completely blown away and thinking this is probably, what a young Bill Clinton was like or a young Nelson Mandela was like. He had this kind of larger than life persona, this charisma, the way that, he just seemed like a real politician in a good sense, the kind that just when they're talking to you, you feel like you're at the center of the world. And I just remember the more I reported on him, the more I thought, I remember a source saying to me at the time, if Russia had real politics, he would have a real future here, but Russia doesn't.
And you were with his wife just last night.
Yeah, I just happened to run into her in the lobby of this hotel where the Munich Security Forum is playing out. She was talking to some people I know as well. And, I said hi, asked her how Navalny was doing. Everybody asked her this, and she said, oh, he's great. And I said, really? That's not possible, right? And she's like, look, everybody asks me this, and I'm trying to find a short way to respond. And the formula I've settled on is saying he's doing really well under really bad circumstances. That was around 10 p.m. last night. Less than 24 hours later, we know what happened. Or we don't know what happened.
Yeah. Well, we've been discussing and we will continue to discuss. I just have to go to the next break. You're watching The World with me, Yalda Hakim. In a moment, we'll be getting reaction from the United States and finding out what US President Joe Biden had to say. You're watching The World with me, Yalda Hakim. We've got a special program following the death of Alexei Navalny, and I've just got some breaking news that's just come in. As we've been reporting, there's been a crackdown on any sort of visible signs of support for Alexei Navalny today in Russia. People have been able to come out and lay flowers and wreaths, but they have not been able to show any kind of support for him. We've now received some information from OVD Info that more than 100 people have already been detained at rallies in memory of Alexei Navalny. The arrests were made in 8 cities across Russia, including Moscow and St. Petersburg. So more than 100 people arrested and detained in rallies in memory of Alexei Navalny. Our Moscow correspondent Diana Magne was saying that people were able to put out flowers, but they weren't able to hold banners or show any kind of visible signs of support for Alexei Navalny. As we've also been reporting, there has been global condemnation from the United Kingdom, Ukraine, the United States. Let's just have a little listen to what the US President Joe Biden had to say.
Make no mistake, Putin is responsible for Navalny's death. Putin is responsible. What has happened to Navalny is yet more proof of Putin's brutality. No one should be fooled, not in Russia, not at home, not anywhere in the world. Putin does not only target his citizens of other countries, as we've seen what's going on in Ukraine right now, he also inflicts terrible crimes on his own people. And as people across Russia and around the world are mourning Navalny today because he was so many things that Putin was not. He was brave, he was principled, he was dedicated to building a Russia where the rule of law existed and where it applied to everybody. Navalny believed in that Russia. He knew it was a cause worth fighting for, and obviously even dying for.
That was US President Joe Biden speaking at the White House earlier today. Well, let's bring in our US correspondent, James Matthews, who's live in Washington. James, we've been hearing from, as we heard there, the US President Joe Biden. We also here in Munich heard from the US Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, and Vice President Kamala Harris.
That's right. All of them, Yalda, pointing the finger at Russia. Make no mistake, Putin was responsible. Those were the words of President Joe Biden when he spoke earlier today. Alexei Navalny has always played rather high in terms of America's discussion around Vladimir Putin's Russia. He is, or has been held up as a political warrior, a real-life illustration of the politics of autocracy and its consequences, a personification of the oppressed. And President Biden spoke very warmly of him today, speaking about a man of principle, bravery, dedicated to building a better Russia as he would see it. In terms of America's response, in the past we've heard Joe Biden in 2021 saying it would be devastating for Russia, for Vladimir Putin, if Navalny died in prison. There was a lot of chat around what he actually meant by that. He never confirmed options. Today, he said that he was looking at a whole number of options. Option number one, clearly, is Ukraine funding. The $60 billion that's locked in that building behind me, Yalda, Capitol Hill. There are Trump-aligned Republicans standing in the way of that, reluctant to pass it through. Interestingly today, Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, he's the man who can bring about a vote on that money. He spoke about the aggression of Putin, spoke about how every means available should be used to cut off his ability to fund his unprovoked war. So perhaps a shift in the sense of urgency required to get this funding and to send it west to Ukraine. It may be significant, particularly as that comes from Trump-aligned Mike Johnson, and there is a Trumpian view here that Vladimir Putin isn't quite the threat that he is portrayed as by Biden and others who very much want to send $60 billion to President Zelensky.
James Matthews, thank you so much for joining us here on the programme. Well, let's bring in Tom Malinowski, former United States representative and a former Washington director to Human Rights Watch. Tom, good to see you. Although, you know, I think this has really shocked everyone here in Munich. It's dominated the news here and dominated the agenda today.
It should dominate the agenda. It reminds us of the evil that the Russian regime under Putin represents. It reminds us of the threat that it poses to Europe and to the world. It reminds us of our responsibility to do what Navalny and the good people who are fighting this regime in Russia and defending their country against it in Ukraine need us to do in the coming weeks and months and years.
And I guess, Tom, the question then is, what is that? Are there any sanctions even left, given the war in Ukraine?
Yeah, let's win the war in Ukraine. That's the ultimate sanction. Economic sanctions have been imposed. They can and should be strengthened. The most important thing we can do is to finish the job in Ukraine, to help Ukraine win and to defeat Putin's war machine. The U.S. Congress has a decision to make about that. I'd say the second thing that we can and should and hopefully will do is to remember what Navalny taught us about Putin, that he's basically just a thief. We have Putin's money, mostly in European banks. What better response to this than to take the money that Putin stole from the Russian people and to give it to Ukraine to help rebuild and defend their country? That's a decision European governments have to make.
But in terms of what the Americans can do, what the Biden administration can do, all day we've heard condemnations and concerns about what's going on in Russia. But what more are they going to do?
Look, there's not much that the Biden administration can do right now without the U.S. government as a whole, and I'm thinking about the United States Congress, doing what it has to do, fulfilling its responsibility to renew the aid to Ukraine. There aren't words or sanctions that could compensate for a failure to do that most basic thing. But if we do that basic thing, and I believe despite the dysfunction in the U.S. Congress today, I believe we will, that will be the powerful statement, the statement that Putin fears. And I shouldn't call it a statement, it's an action that he will feel very strongly.
Why do you think this has happened now? And do you think it's linked to the Russians feeling emboldened by the situation in Ukraine?
I don't know. That's speculation. I don't know what goes through Putin's head on any given day. He has an election coming up. He may be thinking about purely domestic issues. Navalny was not just any critic, he was an effective critic. I think deep down Putin understands that 100 years from now, people are going to see him, Putin, as the criminal and Navalny as the hero. And I think that makes him very insecure with respect to Navalny. Maybe he was thinking we're all in Munich today, that Zelensky's going to be here. Maybe he was thinking about the situation in Congress. I don't know. But I know what we have to do. We have to win in Ukraine. We have to hold this regime accountable. We have to change this situation. We have the power to do that. We have to make the right decisions.
You just talked there a little bit about Navalny. I mean, I think what made him so frightening to Putin was the fact that he was a patriot. He was a Russian patriot.
Yes.
And although, you know, Putin supporters will come out today and say, well, he was a Western puppet, but actually he was a nationalist, he was a patriot.
He was. He actually was somewhat uncomfortable about engaging with Western governments. He wasn't taking grants. He often wouldn't take meetings with visiting Western diplomats and officials. He built a genuinely Russian movement, and that's part of what made him so threatening to Putin. And he did it by exposing Putin's greatest weakness, the fact that Putin is deep down, as I said, a thief who steals from his people, surrounded by other powerful, wealthy men who also steal Russia's wealth, and conveniently, for us, put that wealth in banks and real estate in Western countries. We have it, and it's frozen. We have to decide what to do with it, and I hope this is the final decisive argument that we need to do the right thing, and that is to seize it permanently and use it constructively to help Putin's victims.
Tom Malinowski, always good to talk to you. Thank you so much for joining us. You're watching The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Coming up in a moment, we'll be hearing from Alexei Navalny's wife, Yulia. She was here at the conference today. She spoke about what she described the horrific regime in Russia and said that the international community needs to fight against it.
I will always remember the atmosphere at the Shanghai protests. It was an electric mix of excitement, fear, and defiance, and a sense that history was being made.
We beg you to let Madeleine come home.
My most memorable story was, and still is, the disappearance of Madeleine McCann.
I've seen people who believe and strive for the American dream, even in the face of disaster.
I'm Katie Spencer and I'm Sky News' arts and entertainment correspondent. When you think of Glastonbury, it's mud you want and music. They're going to cross to us live in a minute. Okay.
We always were capable of doing this.
Oh, they're wonderful children as an audience.
Who did that? Maverick here on the red carpet. I'm so excited. Hello. We take you to the heart of the stories that shape our world.
Nor have I ever struck any woman in my life.
There's this illusion of power.
Are you feeling well? I remember covering the Oscars and that now infamous moment, the Will Smith slap. You can tell from these crowds just how excited people are for the return of Fly.
These actors playing the lead roles were born long after the Sex Pistols broke up.
As a team, we've interviewed some of the biggest stars in the world.
Okay, I'll talk to you.
Don't leave me.
Yeah, okay.
There's no easy goodies. There's no easy baddies.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. You're watching The World with me, Yalda Hakim, for this special programme following the death of Alexei Navalny. Well, today here at the Munich Security Forum, we heard from Alexei Navalny's wife. She called on the international community to put on a united front and take on what she called a horrific regime. Let's just have a listen to what she had to say.
I would like that Putin and all his coterie, Putin's friends, his government, to know that they will be accountable for what they've done to our country, to my family, and to my husband. They will be liable for that. That day will come very soon. I would like to call upon the global community, everyone in this room, people around the world, so that we would unite together and overcome that evil.
That was Alexei Navalny's wife, Yulia, speaking today at the forum. Well, this is the kind of stoicism that this couple has often shown, a united front that they have shown together, tremendous bravery to stand up to Russia's president. I also want to play you now another clip, and this one is from the Oscar-winning documentary made about Navalny's career and his incarceration. At the end of the film, he talks about a message that he has should he die or be killed. Have a listen.
My message for the situation when I'm killed is very simple: not give up.
Do me a favor, answer this one in Russian.
И здесь у меня просто очевидная вещь. Ну, не сдавайтесь. Не надо, нельзя сдаваться. Если это произошло, это означает, что мы необыкновенно сильны в этот момент, раз они решили меня убить. И нужно использовать эту силу. Не сдаваться. Помнить о том, что мы огромная сила, которая находится под гнетом вот этих вот чуваков плохих, лишь потому что мы не можем осознать, насколько действительно мы сильны. Все, что нужно для торжества зла, это бездействие добрых людей. Поэтому бездействовать не надо.
That was the voice of Alexei Navalny in that Oscar-winning documentary talking about keeping the fight going, asking for people to continue to protest if he is ever killed. Well, let's bring back our panel, Bill Browder and Julia Yoffe. They join us here. And I mean, really, those words will haunt people if they do nothing, because this is something that he called for. He said, if I get killed. And it's also something he knew might happen.
Well, I mean, everybody knew that it might happen. You know, Putin makes a very clear message to everybody, which is, if you cross me, you'll be killed. And we've seen Boris Nemtsov, who was another opposition leader, who was gunned down right in front of the Kremlin after organizing protests. We saw Sergei Magnitsky, my lawyer, who was killed after uncovering a massive government corruption scheme. This is what happens to people. And so Alexei Navalny wasn't naive about this. He just thought that if he could outlive Putin, you know, that maybe that Putin would go down before he did. And he made a calculation, and sadly, tragically, his calculation was wrong.
And that's the thing. Sorry, go ahead, Julia.
No, what I was going to say is, you know, hearing those words now, hearing Alexei say, you know, keep fighting, it's really hard to hear because he was better and smarter at fighting than anybody else in the Russian opposition, even than Boris Nemtsov, who was wonderful and charming and charismatic. Alexei was very strategic. He was very creative. And he organized all kinds of incredible schemes for how to get people to come out, how to get people to vote in such a way that it would upset the Kremlin's election strategy, for example, in a way that really infuriated them. Again, he fought in a way and he organized people in a way that nobody else could. And it's hard to imagine what that fighting will look like, what that fight will look like without him. Whether it'll just be disorganized.
Hopeless now? Does it feel hopeless?
Yeah.
It's really it sends shockwaves that the most important political figure in Russia, and he's the only political figure. Putin's not a political figure. Putin is a dictator. He's not somebody who's won the hearts and minds of Russians. He's somebody who has now submitted all the Russians to his will, and it's kind of, you know, if you want to be in politics, you die, and the most talented politician is dead.
Yeah.
And it's kind of hard to see where anything goes from here, other than the, you know, continuation of a more and more isolated dictatorship.
He was also, you know, he was a politician, like I said, in the good sense of the word. And after the 1990s, Russians were so disillusioned with politics. They saw it as something dirty that's done up there, you know, behind a wall that we're not part of, we don't want to be part of because it's dirty and gross. And he showed people that that's not true, that politics is something that affects your daily life. He made people care about and notice where their tax rubles were going. He organized, he managed to tap into something, you know, he organized election headquarters all across the country. He glad-handed. He had people who volunteered for him at great risk to themselves. He had people come out, anytime he called for protests, people would come out across each of Russia's 11 time zones in hundreds of towns and cities. He made people see that politics was actually a real thing and a real force that they could harness. And the one other thing I'll say is that what I see people of my generation and younger saying, feels like our future was taken from us today.
A devastating situation for so many. Julia, Bill, thank you both for joining us here on the program. Well, that brings to an end our special on Alexei Navalny. As you can hear, that it has shocked, stunned the world and all of his supporters. From me here from Munich, Yalda Hakim, good night.